Are we
Still missing David.
our fourth speaker? We know anything about our fourth speaker?
Good evening. We're going to start now.
Hopefully he won't arrive.
Just real briefly to set the tone, I'd like for everyone to do two things, and you can position yourself any way you want. The first is, let's give some thought and gratitude to the people that cultivated the soil for almost 15,000 years up and down this coast. Thank goodness they were doing it. If we'd have started 15,000 years ago, we might be in trouble. But the Mitsumats, many people refer to them as the Chumash, the people who came over from Santa Cruz Island. Just take a moment to be thinking about giving gratitude to the land that we are on, that they have prepared for us. One other thing is, before we get down and dirty, no pun intended, what we're talking about has a context that is very frightening to some people, what's happening to Mother Earth. I'd like everyone to just take just a moment of reflection and think about this, that in the Trail of Tears, mothers sang a song to their children in the midst of that horrible situation that looked for the beauty all around. And the way the song goes is, did you see the animals in the clouds this morning, my little baby? Did you see the grass growing back and forth? Did you hear the brook? So just take a moment. I'm going to play the original melody to that lullaby. And imagine a mother singing that to her baby. And imagine how, if they can see the beauty all around in spite of what we're going to be talking about, so can you. Just take a moment and give thanks and reflection. Gosh, you. Welcome.
Thank you for arrows. Good afternoon. Greetings, friends, members of the fielding community, members of the Santa Barbara community, friends, colleagues. My name is Elena Nicholson, and I'm Director of Development at Fielding. And I'm also a staff member of the Sustainability Working Group, and I have the honor to open the presentation tonight, titled Eroding Lives, Soil, Social Justice, and the Environment. This presentation is produced and sponsored by the Sustainability Working Group, PhD concentration in leadership for social and ecological sustainability, and the Marie Fielder Center for Democracy, Leadership, and Education. Fielding Sustainability Working Group is a cross-schools initiative started by students, alumni, and faculty. It proposes the support of action for environmentally, socially, and economically sustainable, just, and diverse world, with Fielding Graduate University emerging as a leader in sustainability in postgraduate academic setting. I would like all members of the Sustainability Working Group to stand up. And we have some faculty members, students, and staff. Thank you so much. Thank you for doing the work. The PhD concentration in leadership for social and ecological sustainability provides training in the skills required for students to become effective practitioners in the field of sustainability. Professor Richard Applebaum is the chair of the concentration. And tonight we also have distinguished leaders of this concentration, Dr. Fred Steyer, Dr. David Blake Willis, and Dr. Melchior Hall. The mission of the Marie Fielder Center for Democracy, Leadership, and Education is to encourage research that addresses today's educational and social problems. The center provides a multidisciplinary space for Fielding's faculty, students, alumni, across all disciplines to engage in research, public discourse, and advocacy on the advancement of social democracy, leadership, and education. Dr. Orlando Taylor is the director of the center. And he works hand in hand with Dr. Katie McGraw, director of sponsored programs and special projects. The Marie Fielder Center is also sponsoring the reception that will follow after the panel discussion. So I invite, on behalf of the Marie Fielder Center, I invite you all to stay, continue the conversation, and learn more about the center. And if you would like to have additional materials about its work, they're outside at the table outside this room. I'd also like to point out that we are recording this discussion tonight, and it will be available on Fielding's YouTube channel. So share widely, and just know that it is recorded. And now it is my great honor to invite President Katrina Rogers to make special remarks.
Hello, everyone. Thank you and welcome. First, I'd just like to say I'm just so proud of these three groups and the way that they collaborate together and work together. Thank you, students, alumni, faculty, trustees, and our colleagues here. And thank you as well for all being here today for this very important work. We also have a number of staff people as well. We also have a couple of honored guests, and they may not want me to call them out, but I'm going to anyway, because we have two of our board chairs with us, one past and one present. So I'd like to introduce Russ Goodman, please. Russ is our past board chair and one of the chairs that I worked with early on in my presidency. And it's just a measure of his faith and interest and commitment to Fielding that you and your spouse are here today. Thank you. Our current board chair is also here, Karen Bogart. Thank you, Karen, for being here today. Karen is also an alumna of Fielding who wrote her dissertation in the area of good governance in companies related to sustainability. So delighted to have you here as well. And all our trustees are good stewards who donate their time and their talent and also share their monetary gifts with us. And part of our work at Fielding is to be sustainable so we can have these kinds of conversations and advance the critical research and the generation of new knowledge that help us really achieve sustainable change for human beings, our societies, and also for the earth. We hold this container, we hold it lightly and we hold it well because we are people who believe that graduate education and knowledge is critical for collective and positive social action and change. And many of you in this room have made significant contributions to the Marie Fielder Center, to the Sustainability Working Group, and as well as other programs at Fielding because you too believe in this mission. So I just want to call out and celebrate just a few of these. As many of you know, one of our clinical psychology graduates, Diane Kipnis, welcome, provided $1 million gift to our library this year. This is so important for our students so they can conduct the kind of research that they need. We can add things to the library and we can expand it for our alumni. That just is a measure of the fact that there is support for this work out there in the world. They may not be in the room today, but they're with us. Another scholarship fund that was funded this year was Dr. Charles McClintock and Carol Wilburn funded a scholarship in order to help students out working on dissertations. And I want to thank you. I believe, Charles, you were in the room. Thank you very much. And while there are many other gifts, the third gift I wanted to call out is Elizabeth Hardy, also a graduate in clinical psychology and had been a student trustee on the board, funded a scholarship to honor a faculty member, Sherry Hatcher. So I just say this in the spirit of remembering we are not alone. There are many other people here committed to this. So to the topic at hand, I also am in the field of environmental policy in this case, and I've been tracking my entire career, environmental politics, environmental history, and what's happening on the planet. Soil loss affects every living thing on Earth. And to be truly sustainable, we as human beings have to practice an inclusive mindset that takes into consideration all living things. All of us this year experienced hardship related to various environmental events. Those of you who live locally, of course, the mudslides were a year and 2 days away from that event where 21 people lost their lives right here in this community, but also fires, not just last year, but throughout this year. Hurricanes, for colleagues from the University of Virgin Islands, just know, and then there are those of you in other parts of the country and other parts of the world who've experienced these things, because it is happening all over the planet. And remember, it falls disproportionately on the voiceless and the marginalized. So let all the voices not being heard speak through us today. And just to sum up, I'd like to remind us of the words of an environmental historian, Donald Worcester, who said, "We are entering a new phase of history, a time when we begin to rediscover the indigenous teaching that power must entail restraint and responsibility. Also, that the ancient awareness that we are interdependent with all of nature and that our sense of community must take in the whole of creation." So now I would like to introduce Dr. Kay Melchor Quick Hall, who has academic credentials in both computational and social sciences. Dr. Hall, you're a true transdisciplinarian. And as a scholar activist, her dissertation research explored and focused on the importance of cassava bread, or ariba in the Garifuna language, which is central to the development in Honduras's rural Black indigenous Garifuna community. She highlighted the importance of Black women's work in community development as an important aspect, is also an important aspect of your commitment and your work. In addition to working with rural farmers in Honduras, Dr. Hall also works in solidarity with food activists right here in the United States. For example, such as those at Soul Fire Farm, and understands how important science is to Black and Indigenous livelihoods. She's trained and taught in various STEM disciplines, including mathematics, computer science, and environmental science. Dr. Hall is committed to increasing access and opportunities for historically underrepresented populations, including Black and Latino populations. We're delighted to have her here as a faculty colleague at Fielding Graduate University. Thank you so much, Dr. Hall. You are on.
Hello, everyone. And I just want to say one small thing, is that I'm also affiliated with the doctoral concentration, Inclusive Leadership for Social Justice. I just wanted to give a shout out to, to that concentration. And because Soul Fire Farm was mentioned, I'm not supposed to do this really, but Farming While Black just came out. Soul Fire's Farm to Liberation on the Land. So just in case you're interested. So I'm here basically as a timekeeper, moderator, and hope to facilitate conversation about some of the things that are going to come up in today's presentations. I'm going to do quick intros. We hope that most of the time here will be spent in dialogue with the presenters, and so I'm not going to say much more than that. I'm just going to introduce the first two people, and I'll come up between speakers so that at least I sometimes forget if somebody introduces everybody in the beginning. So that's what I'll do. So we're going to start with a pair that are going to co-present. Jill Cloutier, a graduate of UCSB Santa Barbara City College film, Santa Barbara City College film production and the permaculture design course, is a director, producer, and writer at Sustainable World Media Films. She hosts and produced 2 podcasts, Sustainable World Radio and The Plant Report. Every plant has a story. Her films and podcasts focus on solutions to environmental challenges that benefit both planet and people. She is also the PR director for Explore Ecology, an environmental education and arts nonprofit, and has taught classes on healthy watersheds, composting, and waste reduction. She was the co-founder of Kale, Not Jail, a gardening program at the Santa Barbara Juvenile Hall, where she grew organic plants with teens on probation. So if you can welcome her. Carol Hiroshima, a graduate of the University of California, Santa Barbara, and the Brooks Institute of Photography and Film, is a producer and editor with over 25 years of experience in multimedia production. Her work includes editorial for Early Edition Discovery Channel, Shark Week episodes, an extreme adventure series for Hit Entertainment UK, and the underwater children's series called Seascope for John Michael Cousteau Productions and Hit Entertainment UK. As an independent producer and editor, Carol teamed up with colleague Jill Cloutier to promote environmental education through multimedia. Together, they are the creators of Sustainable World Media, based in Santa Barbara, California. Carol currently works for Fielding Graduate University as a multimedia specialist and is enrolled in Fielding's Media Psychology Certificate program. Please welcome her.
You can log on to the computer.
With that, I'm going to pass it to Carol and Jill.
So we're here today to talk about soil, one of our favorite topics. And we did a film about soil in 2012, and it's the soil solution to climate change. And at the time when we were doing the film, we would tell people we were doing a film on soil, and they would just, their eyes would glaze over. It's like, why? Like, what is it about soil that's so exciting? And when we learned about what was going on in the ground beneath our feet, we felt like we just had to educate, we wanted to educate others about this amazing world that's a lot of us are unaware of. Yeah. Yes.
Okay, so our film started out as a feature film. It was around 60 minutes long. And over the course of screening it, we edited it down to 30 minutes. And so today we brought to you a 10-minute version that focuses on rangeland management.
And which is a potential solution to climate change. And one last thing before we air it is just, we really tried through our media work and the film to focus on solutions instead of the problem.
As global temperatures rise and erratic weather continues across the planet, people around the world are searching for a solution to climate change. One solution to this crisis may be found in the ground beneath our feet. Scientists, researchers, and land stewards are now studying soil and the carbon cycle as a biological solution to climate change. Through photosynthesis, plants absorb carbon from the atmosphere. The process of converting atmospheric carbon dioxide into soil carbon is called the carbon cycle. The carbon cycle uses sunlight, plants, soil, and microorganisms to turn CO2, a climate change-causing gas, into soil organic matter. But the soil that can help us solve the climate crisis is disappearing.
Soil is kind of one of the unsung heroes, possibly our saving grace when it comes to climate change, because it is one of those things that it's not a new technology. It doesn't require massive investment in new systems. It literally is pay attention to what's there and try to rehabilitate what we've lost. It's a solution right under our feet. We don't really have to do too much except not destroy it.
Most of us are unaware that beneath our feet lies a vast world teeming with life. We depend on this valuable natural resource called soil. Fertile soil supports plants and provides us with oxygen, medicine, food, fiber, and building materials. Soil is home to countless species, nature's ultimate recyclers, that turn waste into value and feed the plants that in turn feed us. Soil purifies our water and is a natural reservoir for atmospheric carbon. Civilizations rise and fall due to their management of soil. Our survival depends on protecting and regenerating this important natural resource, this living universe beneath our feet, called soil.
We've lost an estimated, some say 50%, some say 80% of our topsoil globally over the last couple hundred years due to intensified farming practices. And a big part of that soil loss, of course, is soil carbon loss. The implications are that, therefore, our soils have the potential to hold enormous quantities of carbon because we've lost enormous quantities of carbon. And so the potential reservoir is sitting waiting, and we just have to adjust our management so that we are putting more carbon into the ground than we're allowing to escape.
Every year, an estimated 24 billion tons of valuable soil is lost forever.
There are many soils where we've depleted the carbon in them and where good agricultural practice could restore some of that carbon, which would increase the fertility of the soil. It would increase its ability to hold water. It would increase infiltration. You know, carbon in soil is just good for the soil and for the way we tend to use it. But the carbon isn't going to move from the atmosphere into the soil by itself. You know, water runs downhill because it does. Carbon moves into the soil because plants take it up and they fix it into leaves and roots, and then that stuff dies and decomposes. So, you know, when I look at the way an ecosystem works, I like to talk about, well, there's the life history of plants and there's the death history of plants. And it's just as important, because what happens to a plant after it dies is what controls whether the carbon ends up in the soil. But the death history of plants is also the life history of microorganisms, of insects, of worms, of bacteria, and of fungi. And those are all the things that I study, you know. So it's like, yeah, I study dead plants and they're pretty cool.
Healthy soil is alive with billions of organisms, including fungi, bacteria, and invertebrates. We depend on the invaluable array of beneficial ecosystem services they provide.
The soil food web is all of the interactions of the different organisms that exist in soil, performing all the processes to help plants grow in a healthy fashion. So the plant can have all the nutrients that it's supposed to have. It's not going to be subject to disease or insect pests. We don't have to use inorganic fertilizers if we've got a good, healthy food web. All those interactions are going on. Building soil structure, so water and oxygen move into the soil, making nutrients available back to the plant. So it's all of those sets of interactions.
So if the soil food web microbes are what actually cause a plant to grow, assist it, immune system, food support.
But many ranchers that we work with are trying to get back to that model, back to sort of nature's image of grazing in arid and semi-arid landscapes. And once you start mimicking that, then you have healthier ecosystems. And now we know that means more carbon sequestered in soils. So it's really, really a nice loop all the way around, from the sun to the soils, to the plants, to the food, to you.
So we've actually never grazed this area with electric fencing. This used to be harvested with our tractors. So this is, you know, a real change, basically, a real conversion in a more sustainable way of doing things. So we're in the process of learning how we do this, and And so far, we've seen really good results. And it's pretty interesting to see what the cows actually do here. Yeah. So here they come. In terms of what they can do for us, they're much better at tilling up the soil. You could see they leave a lot of pock marks in the ground, and they push in some of the green matter, and they allow it to compost better. They also allow these pockets where water can accumulate. So if it rains, we absorb a lot more water than a place that's been tilled flat, because there's all these little cups essentially that can catch the water and let it slowly filter in. It also increases the surface area of the field by making it more corrugated. So there's more places for seeds to germinate.
The beauty of all of this is that anyone who has the access to a piece of land, and it could be your backyard, it could be a flower box, has the capacity to participate in this process. So really it's about just getting out on the land and engaging with it intentionally, knowledgeably, but proactively to begin to accelerate the rate at which we're building soil carbon.
Climate change and our impact upon the environment will determine our future. Anything that we do to increase soil fertility is a step in reversing climate change. We can take excess carbon out of the atmosphere and put it to beneficial use in the soil. There is a solution to climate change waiting just beneath your feet.
Wow. Go ahead. So one thing we did want to make clear is that we think that this is one in a toolkit of climate change solutions. It's not going to, I think it would take, and I think Josh can talk more about this maybe, but I think it will take a long time and a worldwide effort to actually sink all that carbon into the soil and then not touch it. But I think it's a valuable tool that we can use to help mitigate climate change. We're more comfortable letting the film
Yes,
speak.
I'm actually way more comfortable behind the
Usually
camera.
in dark rooms or behind the camera.
That would be
Yeah.
me.
Does anyone have a camera? If we know, we'd be more comfortable now. Yeah.
Well, the interesting thing about our film, and I think the most important thing, was to get the message out and educate people. Our film screened 8 times across the United States and Canada, or 8 film festivals, and it traveled with an organization called 350.org during their summer campus tour. So we felt very honored to be a part of that.
And we really set out, and I think I was mentioning this earlier, to really focus on solutions, because we've been working in the environmental movement for a long, long time. And I feel like people just get overwhelmed when you start talking. We all know the problems. And I think it's easy just to go home and binge on Netflix because you can deal with the problems. And so we thought, how can we present this issue, but in a way that would touch people and not alienate people? Because we were working with ranchers and environmentalists who in modern history are kind of at odds. And so that was really exciting to kind of bring everyone together and include them in the film and look for common ground, literally the common ground.
No, so from my perspective, I was the editor, so it was really challenging in a way to find sort of a neutral territory where we weren't forming a biased opinion on in our projection of this problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And one thing too that people often ask is, how can you manage your soil to increase soil carbon? And so I think if you watch the whole film, it would be more obvious. But one way is really to help grow healthy microbes. And even if you have like a little window box or garden or community garden, it's really important not to use pesticides or herbicides to increase soil, add compost, increase the soil life by feeding them, actually, literally. And if you have a larger piece of land, it's no-till or low-till, because once you till that land, the carbon just starts going up. Cover crops are great, spreading compost. And in the longer version of the film, we did document the Marin Carbon Project, which is, they were in the New York Times Magazine recently, but that we were documenting them back before their results actually came through. And they have proven that 1 inch of compost spread over rangeland actually will sequester more carbon. However, having to spread compost over all the rangeland in the world is a huge task. So I think that's another tool that we might be able to use. And then another thing is our wallet. If you don't have access to land, you can actually just buy food from a farmer that you know actually respects the soil and takes care of the soil is another great way. And grass-fed beef as well, and dairy products. Because then you saw the cows in the video and they were so happy. At least as happy as cows. They look happy. Who knows if they're happy? But compared to the feedlots, and that was really interesting because the manure in the field is actually a benefit, right? It's compost. But then in the feedlots where they're standing in their own manure, it's just really a sad thing. So it's kind of turning the problem into the solution by having them out on the grass. Are we done? Yeah, Diane.
Wanted to see the entire film. Is that possible?
Yes, we have it on our website. And then in 2015, was it the International Year of Soil?
We released it to the public. It was we were selling it on Amazon, but in
It's still there. Yeah.
It's still there. But in 2015, it was the Year of the Soil. To honor the Year of the Soil, we released it on YouTube. So you can find it on our YouTube channel. It's YouTube/Sustainable World. Or if you just Google the soil solution, it will pop up.
Yeah. Or you can also, I guess that's the easiest way. Huh? Yeah.
Yeah.
What is the great relationship between carbon and water?
We can do this.
Carbon,
I am.
doesn't water, having more carbon in the soil?
It does, yes. Yes, and I know we're getting close to the end of our time, but I did.
Are we at the end?
Are we at the end? Yeah, well, there was just I'll be really quick, a 2014 study of the University of Georgia, and they showed an increase of 8 tons of carbon per year on farms that converted from row cropping to managed grazing, which is kind of what you saw here, and that water retention also rose by 1/3. So I think the more carbon in the soil, the more water retention you're going to have, and happier microbes too.
And also, so what we're going to try to do is have a big question and answer session after all of the panels. In part, I mean, we already saw one of the panelists in other panelists' films, so we assume that there'll be a lot of opportunities for cross dialogue. So, all right. So next we have Kim Waddell. Oh yes. So next we have Kim Waddell. He's the director for the Virgin Islands Established Program for Stimulating Competitive Research, a 14-year-old National Science Foundation supported research capacity building program based at the University of the Virgin Islands. Prior to that, he was a senior program officer with the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine's Gulf Research Program, which works to improve understanding of the Gulf of Mexico's interconnecting human, environmental, and energy systems following the 2011 Deepwater Horizon oil spill. He has also worked to build marine and environmental research capacity in the Caribbean region as a research associate professor at the Texas A&M University. Please welcome Kim Waddell.
Thank you. And I'm pointing that way. Let's see. Well, good afternoon. I want to talk about soil today with you, but in a kind of I don't want to say a negative way, but after hearing some of the opening comments, I feel a little self-conscious because I'm going to be presenting soil as a bit of a problem in the context that in my presentation. And this is the context of soil erosion and how it's become a common indicator of environmental degradation in many Caribbean islands, as well as in the U.S. Virgin Islands. So first, let me give you a quick geography lesson. I live and work in the U.S. Virgin Islands. It's an American territory, as is Guam in the Pacific Ocean. Our neighbor to the west in the Caribbean is Puerto Rico, and that's also a Commonwealth, but all three are part of the United States, but obviously not connected to the mainland. The Virgin Islands are in the Lesser Antilles in the Eastern Caribbean. This map here shows you the three islands. It's not to scale because St. Croix is about 40 miles to the south, and these islands together constitute about 133 square miles. But collectively, they're about 1,100 miles southeast of Miami, and again, 40 miles east of Puerto Rico. The population is primarily Afro-Caribbean, and it numbers around 100,000. And the Virgin Islands, many of you know it or have been exposed to it through tourism. Cruise ships come through the Virgin Islands with amazing frequency, but it's also a premier resort destination. And tourism is a big driver of our economy. It's about 65% of our economy is in the tourism sector, and it's the second largest employer in the territories. So back in September 2017, the Northeastern Caribbean was hit by 2 Category 5 hurricanes. Now, I don't know if any of you have been through a hurricane. I've been through 6 or 7. Well, I thought I'd been through hurricanes until I experienced these 2. They were 2 weeks apart, which is extremely unusual and rare. And the higher track, the upper track on this slide is Hurricane Irma that came through on September 6th. And it devastated about 11 islands, including the British Virgin Islands and the northern U.S. Virgin Islands. Almost a direct hit. And we're talking 200-mile-an-hour winds of like 5 miles from my house. And so then the lower track is Hurricane Maria, which got a lot more press because it impacted Puerto Rico, which has a population of about 3.5 million. And the costs associated with rebuilding Puerto Rico are staggering. As these major storms hit the Caribbean almost every year, but it's a much more rare phenomenon to have 2 storms of this magnitude come through the same region, fairly close region at the same time, and even more rare to have them so close together. And I'll talk about the impacts of these 2 storms back to back in a moment. But with climate change, this is some of the new phenomena we have to keep in mind as we look ahead. The reality is that we spent in 2017 $360 billion in natural disaster response in this country. And that is far and above the highest amount in any given year in our country's history. And the reality is that it isn't a surprise because we've been on a decadal-long trajectory of more and more damage, more and more costs associated with these natural disasters, whether they be fires and mudslides here in California, or tornadoes or hurricanes that hit the Gulf and East Coast. But the reality is that climate change is associated, and certainly with hurricanes, the intensity and frequency or strength of these storms is driven a lot by climate change related effects such as sea surface temperature and what have you. So what does a Hurricane 5 damage, what does it look like? So here are a NOAA image capturing the loss of the electrical grid in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is a large, well-lit island on the top left side, and then the Virgin Islands are to the right, and then in the lower frame post Hurricane Maria, you can see the loss of our power grid across the entire territory. Here's another satellite image of both the British and the Northern Virgin Islands. I guesstimate that we lost in the first storm about 90% of our foliage. And so you can see the change just in color between the two slides. Now, we also got about, in the first storm, about 15 inches of rain, which did a lot of damage, but the first storm was considerably stronger in its wind power. I mean, again, 150 to 200 miles an hour. The second storm, because we didn't have the foliage, we saw the interaction between hard rainfall and exposed soils. And so what we saw in the second storm, which was slower and slightly milder, comparatively speaking, still a category 5, we saw that the exposed soils were ravaged by the heavy rains with nothing to blunt the force of the the vegetation to blunt the impact of the rainfall. And so we saw massive mudslides, road closures, and heavy erosion events following the second storm. So up close, this is Meghans Bay. It's an iconic beach in the north side of St. Thomas. You can see pretty much the exact same angle, and you can see the loss of vegetation. What happened here? Let's see. There we go. So this is what I mean by erosion and soil loss. And this is, both these photographs are during and after the hurricane. You can see a massive amount of runoff to the point that over time, over several hours, you will see the even hard substrates like roadbeds get completely gouged out and add to the debris field that then fills up these roads in these low-lying communities near the coast. This is the waterfront in St. Thomas. That is a 4-lane road there in the middle that looks like two rivers with a plant barrier in between. And that orange tint captures the fact that that is sediment-loaded water that's rushing towards the coastal areas. This is, yeah, I mean, I still get kind of choked up when I see these images because it was something to behold. So, not surprisingly, and in common in a lot of coastal areas, the impacts of these types of disasters are often disproportionately felt by certain communities. You know, the wealthy folks in St. Thomas live up on the hillsides. They got great views, they got great, beautiful breezes, and they have the amenities of well-maintained properties, you know, gardeners and the whole lot. Meanwhile, in the lower elevations, you have modest income folks living in more crowded conditions in areas that are more prone to flooding. And as you can see, there's an enormous amount of sediment in these soils. And this is a community called Bovoni on the south coast or south side of St. Thomas. We call that bridge to nowhere, just because it, you know, as you can tell, it doesn't go anywhere at this particular time. But these communities are often impacted not just during hurricanes, but also during heavy rain events, which happen 3, 4, 5 times a year, just depending on the season. So these are communities that invariably see several times a year flooding, road closures, and debris piling up in their homes when it's this severe. So it's not just the terrestrial ecosystems that take a beating with these this runoff and the erosion. All that water and all that debris has to go somewhere and eventually drains into our coastal and marine ecosystems. And so this is Meghans Bay, that iconic beach I showed you just a little bit ago. This is a sediment plume that is a half mile across. That Peterborg Point on the far side is about a mile. And so I live near this vantage point, a little bit higher and to the west. And I've seen sediment plumes that go 2 miles offshore. So when they are that extensive and that persistent, and in the case of the 2 hurricanes, we had them back to back, the water didn't clear up. It just didn't. And so you smothered huge quantities of coastal, you know, coral reefs and marine habitat, and it's still recovering at this point. So I was invited to talk about soil conservation or soil in general, and I'm sort of focusing in on soil conservation. This is a long established approach and practices that have been brought to the Caribbean, but the topography of many of the islands in the Caribbean, especially in the Lesser Antilles, as you'll see in future slides, there's a lot of elevation, there's a lot of slopes and hillsides. And so soil conservation is incredibly important, but it's very difficult to manage and guide, and for a number of reasons. But I've listed a handful here. Land is very expensive. I mean, it reminds me of other coastal areas with great views and amenities, like here, where real estate is staggeringly expensive. And so the islands are gentrifying. I mean, that's just one of the realities. And consequently, if you're asking a subsistence farmer or a landowner to set aside green space or barriers that actually provide the kind of ecosystem services that, either filter the water as it runs down the hillside or actually capture the sediments, you're asking people to set aside land that they might want to use differently. And so consequently, it's a tough sell. The other reality is that island populations are increasing, frankly, beyond what I call the environmental carrying capacity. St. Thomas, when the Danes sold it to the United States in 1917, there was probably a third of the population, and these islands were self-sufficient in their food and all their resources. Now we're at we have 3 times the population, and we get about 95% of our food shipped in because we've got too many people living on the land, essentially. And then tourism. I mentioned tourism. It's a huge driver, so it's not going to go away. But the reality is that the activities associated with it and the related development around, whether it's hotels and what have you, are displacing agriculture and these green spaces that could, again, provide those ecosystem services. So here is a typical Virgin Islands neighborhood. This is Smith Bay on the east end. This is a medium to high density, very common neighborhood. And yet there are some things here that aren't apparent. And if we were a little bit closer and I had ability to zoom in, you could see some problems. The first one is you see that red barn right there in the front at the lower ground. That is a goat farm. Now, why it's in a highly urbanized area is, well, we'll get to that in a second. But the fact is those are goats down there that are completely denuded, speaking of grazing. Sheep and goats are notorious heavy grazers if they don't have options to move around. And so that whole area around that house is open dirt, essentially. The other problem is that all these homes are on septic systems, so there's no sewer systems or anything like that. And so the roads are rudimentary, they're not well maintained, neither is the drainage system for heavy rainfall. So these combined with the elevation and the terrain, this community sees heavy sediment runoff almost every time it rains. And this is not uncommon across highly populated communities. So there are other challenges we face. We are accustomed in this country to have a well-regulated and monitored, regulation and natural resource management infrastructure that helps us, whether it's EPA, USDA, and the other agencies, or your local agencies. In the Caribbean, these aren't nearly at the same capacity or strength. And so you have governments that don't have the regulatory capacity, and consequently, we have poor land use management practices, and conservation practices they come and they go, but they're not sustained. Within agriculture, we have a lot of programs that are insufficiently funded. I mean, most of you, or any of you that gets funding from, NGOs or foundations or United Nations, or, they're 2-3 year long grants. If you're trying to change behaviors and traditional practices among farmers in particular, who are by nature conservative and, they don't take to change readily in many instances, you need 5 to 10 years. And if you do have 5 to 10 years, then you need multiple funding sources and a sustained flow of funds, as well as the growth and development of the staff to manage those projects. And that, again, is a challenge in the Caribbean. Now, I say farmers are not well educated. I mean that in the formal education context. There's a lot of traditional ecological knowledge. There's a lot of experience-based knowledge that these farmers have, but they are not formally trained. And when programs come in talking about Western science techniques and technology and what have you, there's a little bit of resistance. There's a little bit of a learning curve. And again, that takes time, getting back to the funding challenge. And then when you have government agencies and staffs or NGOs coming in and they have, you know, a bit of the them and us mentality and they do a top-down approach, you get even more resistance. And so consequently, we don't see a lot of success in soil conservation practices. I mean, this is just the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, but it is some of the reality. So what are we doing in the Virgin Islands? And I, you know, to address these challenges and those related to the hurricane, soil conservation is but one desired outcome as it pertains to the broader goal of reducing the impacts of these natural hazards, both man-made and natural hazards, and how they impact the islands. So late last year, I was fortunate enough to get a large award from FEMA and the Virgin Islands equivalent, VITEMA, the Emergency Management Administration in the territory, to do the next hazard mitigation plan for the territories for the next 5 years. And so this gave me and some of my colleagues a real opportunity to work in the community, but taking the lessons from things like how soil conservation projects haven't worked well, but also look at, and drawing upon my own background of working with different communities, what are the elements or principles that you need to integrate into a hazard mitigation plan to make it more effective? Because around the, you know, the country, these hazard mitigation plans are written up, they look great, and FEMA sort of approves them, and then they don't, the recommendations don't get implemented. And so, and we have the same problem in the Virgin Islands. And so we thought that, you know, we want to make this plan and this concept of resilience integrated into the plan, but also use it to help the communities understand what they can do and how they can participate to make themselves more resilient in the face of future disasters. And whether that's in preparedness or in land management practices or what have you, it's an important piece. Sustainability, it's kind of self-explanatory in the sense that whatever implementation or strategies we want to use, they have to be sustainable. You know, the start again, stop again process, it fails regularly. A lot of these hazard mitigation plans do not integrate climate adaptation. Well, that might work in some parts of the world, but in islands that have sea level rise and a lot of other issues that really impact the characterization of hazards and risks and vulnerabilities to communities, it has to be there. And then social cultural awareness, as I mentioned, we have a really diverse population in the Caribbean. What might work in Des Moines, Iowa, or Utah, or Mississippi is not the same story and not the same community or history as we see in these islands. And each island is actually quite different and has a different history. So you can't just one size fits all, even in the Caribbean. And then finally, and the most important piece, the implementation challenge is really comes back to capacity. So the university is the institution of higher learning in the territory, and we have a real opportunity to help train the next generation of hazard mitigation experts, subject matter experts around resilience, but also the technical expertise that's needed in the various government agencies to implement the kind of strategies that are going to make hazard mitigation a reality in the Virgin Islands. And I think I just ran out of time, so I'll stop there. Thank you.
So just so that everyone knows, I promise to be ruthless about the time, and it's not because I'm unkind, it's because we want there to be a lot of time for engagement. So feel free to, in the Q&A, ask certain speakers if they have more to say, but we want to think about this as the beginning of a conversation, not the end. And so we've asked people to stay to our time for that reason. All right. So our next panelist, David Pello, is the Delson Chair of Environmental Studies and Director of the Global Environmental Justice Project at the University of California, Santa Barbara. His teaching and research focus on environmental and ecological justice in the US and globally. His books include What is Critical Environmental Justice and Total Liberation, The Power and Promise of Animal Rights and the Radical Earth Movement, Resisting Global Toxics, Transnational Movements for Environmental Justice. He works with numerous organizations focused on improving the living and working environments for people of color and other marginalized communities. And I'll help with the PowerPoint. Yeah, you're right. Just take the next. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, just that's the events. Yeah.
You didn't know about the extra doctorate she has in this.
Audio visual.
I'm sure pays a hell of a lot better than we do.
All right. Thanks so much. It's a real pleasure to be here today. As with the last presentation, I'm going to talk a bit about some of the problems and challenges with soil and get it from a roundabout way, talking about environmental justice, and then move into food justice as a possible solution that I think has been referenced already, and then return to some of the problems. So I do want to begin with the claim, and I think probably everybody would agree that soil is a social justice concern. It's linked to social justice for what I think are obvious reasons, because it's about access to healthy land for homes, recreation, food production, and on and on. And if that's the case, then it means that soil is also a public health concern, an environmental health concern, and clearly a food and food justice concern. So let me go back a little bit into some contemporary environmental history. Lois Gibbs here, back in the 1970s, 1980s, she began the Love Canal Homeowners Association in response to literally tons of polychlorinated biphenyl and other pollutants being dumped into a canal upon which her child's school and her community was built upon. And then many health problems predictably resulted from that event. And she, of course, is credited with being one of the luminaries in the environmental movement who really pushed for successfully bringing us the Superfund program, which is a fund to try to address, acknowledge, and ultimately clean up some of the most hazardous sites in the United States. And but ultimately, I'd like to say that rereading her work through the lens of soils is something that's really important. She was fundamentally concerned about healthy soils, or the lack thereof, and its impact on her community. Somebody who's maybe less well known is Hazel Johnson, who is known as the Black Mother of the environmental movement. She was my boss for many years when I was living and working in Chicago. She's executive director of a group called People for Community Recovery. She's no longer with us. May you rest in peace, Hazel. But for many years, like Lois Gibbs, she also advocated for environmental justice, bringing together discourses and frameworks that focused on human rights, civil rights, and connecting that to environmental sustainability in her community on the southeast side of Chicago, but also throughout the African diaspora. So doing a lot of networking with people from Nigeria to the south side of Chicago, Mississippi, and Brazil, and fighting and shutting down incinerators, landfills, trying to get a sustainable urban environmental initiative plan introduced into the master plan of the city of Chicago to really take what appeared to be at first a very localized concern around environmental racism, the disproportionate impact of hazards and pollutants on people of color, and really make those linkages to everybody. We're all in the same boat. We're being impacted differently, but we're all in the same boat. Well, one of the things that hit Hazel and her organization really, really hard one day was when it was discovered that there were literally tons of soil right outside her office, and her office is in our actual community of Altgeld Gardens, a public housing community in Chicago. Tons of soil that were actually infested with lead. And so a massive lead abatement program, training of residents who needed and wanted jobs in environmental industries to get them up to speed, skill building, to do that kind of work. And it was to some degree successful. But like Lois Gibbs, she was fighting a whole matrix of problems. But again, people in this community were unhealthy. A community of 10,000, literally the vast majority of people in this community were suffering from some form of respiratory disorder, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, asthma, you name it. And much of that could be traced, or certainly I think we can infer that not only was the air unhealthy, but the land was unhealthy, and people were not able to confidently grow food in that soil. It was truly, truly dangerous. And there were some parts of the community where it was unsafe to walk. This is in the United States of America. So that's an example. Those are examples of things that people have been fighting against. Environmental justice, I think we're all familiar with, but I want to draw from the US EPA agency that used to exist some time ago. Hopefully we can bring that back. The fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, with respect to development, implementation, enforcement of environmental laws, blah, blah, blah. More broadly, it's a goal, it's a vision of ecological sustainability, human rights, social justice, where all of these things are not seen as separate, but are integrated. So that's a more policy wonkish version of it. This is a more artistic version of it. This is a painting by Ricardo Levens Morales, who's a Twin Cities, Minnesota artist. There is a typo in there if someone can find that. Environmental justice is our cry of defiance against the onslaught of oppressive toxins. And I like that, and he turns it around and says toxic oppressions that threaten to submerge our homes. So a nice sort of riff on a famous painting there. The scholarship on this is pretty darn clear. There are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of studies demonstrating, as Kim was pointing out, there's empirical correlations between race, class, immigration status, and various other forms of social marginality and exposure to, proximity to not only pollutants, but of course, natural disasters, and climate change being a very good example of that. And so communities that are socially marginalized are just much more likely to face environmental threats. But this literature also examines the response, the environmental justice movement, climate justice movement, food justice movement, people who are trying to take their fates, their futures into their own hands, not wait for government, not wait for corporate America to address these ills and do something positive. But just to give you a sense of what this looks like in some communities, toxic Superfund sites, going back to the Lois Gibbs story, well, Latinos in Silicon Valley, which is a place we often mistakenly think of as being a place where we've got clean and pristine and high-tech industries that are solving environmental problems, well, they're also producing them. And Latinos live near more toxic Superfund sites than any other group. I'm currently doing some research on the intersections between prisons and environmental concerns. This is a picture of the Northwest Detention Center in Seattle-Tacoma area, where 1,500 people are housed. These are undocumented immigrants awaiting their court proceedings to see whether they will be ejected from these United States of America. That thing is right on top of and adjacent to toxic federally designated Superfund site. I would submit to you that that is not an accident. So, environmental justice and soils. Each of those examples that I just talked about reveals linkages not only between around this question of disproportionate harm, environmental injustice, environmental racism, environmental inequality, disproportionate harm that marginalized communities are dealing with vis-a-vis environmental issues. But we also see that in each of those cases, at the root, or certainly a part of that narrative, is contaminated soils. And so I think for me, we can make connections then between environmental justice and soils by looking at what people in many communities that are fighting for environmental justice are doing today. And that is, as was mentioned in the Leah Penniman book of Soulfire, food justice efforts, which allow communities presumably, hopefully, greater control over and access and connections to land. So a little bit on this, I think most of us are familiar with food justice, but just to refresh us, it's a grassroots initiative. It's a movement emerging from communities in response to these food insecurities, but also economic pressures that leave communities in this bind where they have very little access to healthy food, nutritious food, certainly organic food is in short supply, but also food that is affordable and really, really importantly, culturally appropriate. And this, I think, goes back to the point about looking at the different Virgin Islands. We have different cultural and historical context. Just Food is a New York City-based NGO that defines food justice as communities exercising their right to grow, to sell, and eat healthy food. In other words, an intervention in this dominant food system that is really monopolized and controlled by a very small handful of corporations that tend to be less concerned about democratization of food access. But the bottom line there, of course, for this discussion is that food justice requires access to healthy land and soils. So that's the positive vision. What are we fighting against? Again, like environmental injustice, there's this inequality. And I've already gone over this, but I want to put a fine point on it, that our food distribution systems tend to cater to well-heeled communities. And that would include many of us in Santa Barbara, certainly not all of us. We do have food deserts here that persist, leaving poor areas and many communities of color, working class communities, without access, again, to affordable and healthy and nutritious foods. A colleague of mine, Orrin Williams, who's a food justice activist in Chicago, actually doesn't like the term food desert. A number of people have been talking about this because it assumes that, a desert is a place that is devoid of life, when we know that, of course, deserts are teeming with life. It's just a place that doesn't have a lot of precipitation. I think that's probably the best way to think about it from a layperson's term. So there's a new term that I've been hearing people use, and they're describing as healthy food priority areas. Now that's a mouthful.
I'll take food.
Yeah, food desert may be easier, but we can have that debate. So again, but more broadly than dominant food systems, of course, our industrial ag system places many communities, all communities, frankly, at risk of climate change, of risk of herbicides, pesticides, and we've got to remember that our food systems in this country are often rooted in labor exploitation, including actual enslavement of human beings, and that's going on today. So here's some positive examples of what some people are doing. Will Allen, who's an amazing urban ag food justice activist in Milwaukee, his group Growing Power is literally producing tons of food for people all over the city and the Midwest. And that model, and the model of, he's not the first to do this, of course, that model is being exported to many communities. The D-Town farmers in Detroit, as they've been called, are building hoop houses, growing collard greens. I'm a Southern man. I'm from Tennessee. When I see that, I lick my lips and I really want to get out some garlic and some olive oil and cook up a massive pot of collard greens. So, and this is in a formerly bombed out district of Detroit, post-industrial sort of nightmare where people are living and really creating their dreams and feeding themselves and others. LaDonna Redmond is an amazing food justice activist from Chicago. I think she now lives in the Twin Cities, has really changed policies and the food policies in the city of Chicago's school systems, is doing the same in Minneapolis, and has worked on federal food policy and the Farm Bill to try to get food justice in there. Keith Pozzoli and some colleagues there from some East African communities there in San Diego, the Ocean View Growing Grounds. This is a project of the University of California, San Diego, and a group whose board I serve on, the Global Action Research Center, that is doing this. They've created a 20,000 square foot lot where people come together not only to grow food, but to learn about how to grow food, to learn about cooking, culturally appropriate recipes, and to commune and to really build communities. Here at UCSB, we have at least three projects that have been spearheaded by Indigenous scholars and students and staff to bring culturally appropriate food and medicinal herbs and plants to our Indigenous relations and brothers and sisters on campus there. And the latest is an ongoing project called the Three Sisters Garden: beans, squash, and maize that are traditional to many, maybe not all, but many Southwestern Indigenous communities. And so really pleased to see that happening. The last slide is to bring us back down to earth, so to speak, and be a little bit more realistic. Recent book that I reviewed, Sights Unseen: Uncovering Hidden Hazards in American Cities, really gives us a reality check that if we're going to be doing urban gardening, urban agriculture, we have to deal with the reality that the vast majority of hazardous waste sites in urban America have not been documented. They are literally not on lists of county, city, and federal governments, but they are there. These are what we call relic sites, many of which are not necessarily lethal. There's a whole spectrum and whole range of hazard there, but they've been neglected, and this is a massive, it's a problem, but I also think of it as an invitation for us to do some good work to move beyond risk containment to dealing with soils and making soils healthier in the urban cities, where, after all, we as a human species now dominate in those spaces. So I'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
All right. Our next speaker, Josh Schimmel, is professor in ecology, evolution, and marine biology, and in the environmental studies program. He is a soil ecologist who studies processes that regulate the functioning and health of the soil system, organic matter accumulation, and nutrient supply to plants. And I'll do the prayers. It got ugly last time, I'll get it. His primary research areas have been the Arctic and grassland and chaparral ecosystems in California. Schimmel is an Aldo Leopold Leadership Fellow and a fellow in the Ecological Society of America. He is a highly cited researcher and is a chief editor for Soil Biology and Biochemistry. He is the author of Writing Science, How to Write Papers That Get Cited and Proposals That Get Funded, published by Oxford University Press. Please welcome him.
I got the clicker. I'm going to stand up because I'm a professor. I can't talk sitting down. But I've long been interested in soil as an entity and as a thing not only just of productivity and for feeding the world, but of beauty and of concept. And so I want to sort of offer this starting point. Why do we treat soil like dirt? And I'll start with this question. You know, we think of the oceans as being rich and bountiful, and particularly being in a Department of Marine Science, we get that a lot. And I'd like to start with the question, so in terms of biological productivity, which terrestrial ecosystem is the ocean like? Is it a rainforest? Is it a wheat field? Is it a dry or sort of a modest desert like the Mojave? Or is it the Sahara? Any quick thoughts? Well, the ocean's a desert. And the open ocean is about as productive as the Mojave Desert. We get fish, but we're high-grading the protein off the top of the food web. And the most productive parts of the ocean are only productive because they're getting fed off the land. And so if we take this idea of a desert and ask, what do we get from the ocean? Humans, on the order of maybe about 1% of all human calories come from the ocean. And maybe about 5% of all human protein comes from the ocean. Everything else comes from the land. Now, if you're living in the Caribbean, those numbers are going to be higher. If you're living in Siberia, there's zero. But basically, humans live off the soil. All of what we eat, all of what we take in, it comes from the soil. If we look at it a slightly different way, I forget where I found this, but if you look in this great swath of where Americans get their food, that's seafood and fish, and doesn't only exclude freshwater fish. So essentially everything we eat comes from the soil. Everything we are comes from the soil. So I'll ask the question, why do we call it dirt? The meaning of dirt actually does derive from the Anglo-Saxon word for shit. And if you look at the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, you know, their first two definitions are excrement, unclean matter. This is the word we use for the stuff that is the basis of human society. We call it dirt. And so we think of the four elements, you know, water is the romantic element, air is showy, soil is the humble element. We think of it as this way, and most of the presentations I've seen here focus on this idea of soil as this collection of material. It's sort of brown, it's not very exciting looking, but this is the wrong way to think about soil. Soils actually are natural physical bodies that have evolved in place. And I know soil scientists won't call that handful of stuff soil. They'll call that soil material. They will talk about a soil being that soil horizon, that profile that's carbon rich at the surface and changes as you go down, reflecting the history of the geology and the climate, of the weathering. And so if we look at stuff that's on top of the soil, But when you look at soils, these are 8 state soils. You may not know it, but all states I think of, but South Carolina has official state soil. And not only are these things of just, for me, beauty because the patterns are pretty and cool and they're neat looking, but they reflect the complexity that really exists within soils and why different societies end up so different. So if we look at Vermont, you can see that solid granite on the bottom and a bleached layer in the middle. If you look at North Carolina, the deep reds. If you look at the California San Joaquin, there's that white hard pan in the middle, which kind of makes plowing hard. You look at Iowa and it's like, oh yeah, that's beautiful. I mean, at least if I were a farmer. The deeply weathered oxasols of Puerto Rico, you know, almost fluorescent. And those things are more than just things of beauty. Those control human societies. The very nature of those soils. And so I want to take a quick pedologist perspective on American history. If we look at the United States in about 1800, well, we had these northern soils up in New England. They had been glaciated, they were thin, they were resource poor, they were not well developed up in Maine. You saw the Vermont soil of Pennsylvania, rocky, undeveloped. They were not good farming soils, so they forced people to look to either trees, the oceans, or industry. In balance to that, we had, so they're shallow and stony. In balance to that, we had these subsoils that were south of the glacial line. They were old and weathered. They were depleted in nutrients, but they were extensive. You could grow some other than rocks. They weren't great for growing, food crops, but they were really good for industrial agriculture. And before tractors, it meant that they supported slave-held cotton and tobacco plantations. Those were the industries because those were what the soils could support. And that was in tension and in balance until about 1800 with the opening up of not the far west, but of the near west. And people suddenly started moving over the Appalachians between numbers technology and the die-off of Native Americans. They could get away from the old weather, these challenging soils of the East Coast to the soils of Indiana, of Illinois, of Iowa. Oh my God, these were heaven. Deep soils, fertile soils, not too acidic, weathered from loess blown in from the prairies, and you could grow families without needing either slaves or factories. And as a result, human population moved into these wonderful, wonderful soils. And as the population of the near Midwest that had no interest in slaves because they didn't need them, that's what caused things like the Missouri Compromise and caused the tension that ultimately, of course, led to the Civil War. It was a war over soils. It was driven by soils and could not have happened had they not discovered those soils of the Midwest. Almost as many soldiers came from those areas of the near Midwest as did from old Yankeedom. That's why the Union won, and that's why the war happened. Soils define society. They define what you can eat. We talk about socially appropriate, food and kinds of things. That's because that's what we're used to, and that's what grows in the environments that people have settled. So then we come to how are we treating our soils now? So we see cases where if you don't manage soils well, they erode. And soils are what I call a semi-renewable resource. If you use them well, you can use them over and over and over again for thousands of years. If you use them badly once, you can break it forever. So, here we see this. We see some real erosion. It doesn't look terrible. In the Midwest, you scale that up and you get these sediment plumes flushing out of the Mississippi, old muddy. Well, it's muddier because we have been tilling the prairies of the Midwest and encouraging erosion and depleting those soils. They still support the human population because they're so incredible resource, but we're depleting them. And they will not recover on the timescales of Homo sapiens. And it's all flushing out there. So we look at, an image like this, the Jordan River Valley. We think of the Middle East now as a desert. How on earth was this desert the cradle of human civilization? It wasn't a desert. the cedars of Jordan, of Lebanon. I was at a place in southern France, it was this scrub oak area, and it was on the calcium carbonate plateau, and I was looking around going, this is calcium carbonate, this stuff weathers easily. Why is there no soil here? This ought to be a fertile soil and fertile forest. And I realized I was being really stupid. Because this area, I'm looking at it as what looks like a wilderness. It hadn't been a wilderness for the last 2,000 years. It had been agricultural land and goat grazing, and all that soil had been eroded off by human activity. And only after World War II have the French gotten rich enough that they could just abandon it. But you look at these landscapes and we think this is what it's supposed to look like, and that's not true. This is a human product. It's now a desert that we fight over, but it used to be the richest land on earth that we fought over 2,000 years ago. And we need to remember that we think of soils as, oh yeah, it's just dirt, it'll be there, but that's not true. Human societies rely on our soils. They create us as much as we create them. And as we degrade them through carelessness by treating them like dirt, we end up creating landscapes that will treat us like dirt and will not support either the populations that we would like to support or support them in the way in which we would like to support them, with high quality food, with a diversity of food, and not with stuff that, you can't really grow stuff in there except right down the valley bottom. If we look at maps of the world, these are 4 different maps of the levels of degradation of soils. And I'm just about done. It's a really difficult thing to define what is degraded when it comes to soil, because there's still dirt there, and so we think there's still soil. So there's several different maps, but they all show the same kinds of patterns, which is in the temperate zones where people live, soil degradation to some degree or another is very widespread. Whether how much you call it varies, but most of the areas with high population densities are at least somewhat degraded according to these different maps. Central South Africa, Sub-Sahara, the Pantanal in South America, certainly Europe, much of Asia. This is the resource that is most fundamental above all else to supporting human societies. We are running it down. We don't necessarily need to, but we are, and we need to figure out ways of doing that better. Now, good agricultural land management can either eliminate or minimize degradation, and there are places where that's being done. We've heard about some, but if we continue on this pattern, essentially, we will not be able to support the human population that the world is trying to produce. And that will create new and different kinds of social, military, and just human conflicts. Again, the Civil War was as much a war that grew from soil issues as the social issues that grew from it. So I will stop there. Thank you very much.
All right, last but not least, we have our own
I left it over there, sorry.
Okay, so let me take this. If I stand here, will that work? Okay, can you hear me? Okay, so I'm going to go even deeper than Josh did. And in fact, I'm going to suggest with great respect that all of the wonderful presentations that you just heard, the solutions and the warnings, will not result in an effective action if we don't go deeper. I should have changed the title to Soil as Our Relative, but until we understand that since we changed our worldview from a nature-based worldview that we used for 99% of human history, up until around 7,000 to 9,000 years ago, returning to our more authentic worldview for education and survival will require returning to how we engaged at a deep worldview level. Now, I'm going to go through these really fast. Each one could take a week, But worldview is a set of beliefs about fundamental aspects of reality. So worldview in nomenclature today is it's a belief, it's a religion, it's an ideology. But the scholarship is emerging from Robert Redfield's work that says there's only two worldviews. And it's not a coincidence that there's a cover on his book is somebody, an indigenous person working on the dirt. But there's two worldviews, and under each worldview are religions, cultures, beliefs, and ideologies. Now, when I started doing this work 35 years ago, it was challenged on scholarship. It was dismissed. It was called, romanticizing the indigenous, right? But today we have, and a while back, Edgar Mitchell, the seventh man to walk on the moon, said only a handful of visionaries know that indigenous wisdom can aid in the transition to sustainability. Since then, the United Nations, we ignore indigenous wisdom at the peril of ourselves. Noam Chomsky wrote on the back of one of my books, The Grim Prognosis for Life on This Planet is a consequence of forgetting this wisdom. And he continues to say in it, if we do not reclaim it, we are doomed. Those are Chomsky's words. So you can see David Suzuki, many more scholars are starting to recognize that worldview. This was tweeted out to over 500 million people. And again, it's a guy who wrote a book on this topic. I'm just trying to make the point that worldview reflection, we don't talk much about it and we don't do it. And until we can, I'm going to suggest that we're in trouble. Now, we're not going to go through all the aspects of worldview, but you can see there are many topics about truth. Truth is sacred, acceptance of the mysterious, socially purposeful living, community-based enjoyment, fluid boundaries, flexible age divisions, peace inclined, cyclical. It goes on and on and on. So there's not time to do that now, but we do have the opportunity to learn this worldview and worldview reflection. I've covered a lot of the topics with my own books. And so, the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which not by coincidence was founded by Edgar Mitchell, they are now doing worldview reflection projects in K through 12 schools and having remarkable effects. In Canada, decolonizing education and indigenizing education is beginning to go beyond just talking about indigenous contributions and what kinds of foods they had, but going deeper into worldview reflection. So we're going to start with that a little bit. Here are some quotes that I took from the Western, or let's call it the dominant worldview. And I tried to choose the very, very best ones that I could find. And so Wendell Berry was quoted earlier, right? So, and you chose him because he's a great mind, right? And without proper care for the soil, we can have no life. Gandhi, to forget how to dig in the earth and tend the soil is to forget ourselves. Roosevelt, a nation that destroys its soil destroys itself. Very much in line with the important information Josh was telling us. But now let's look at just one of many quotes from a different worldview. See if you can feel or tell from listening to it the difference between it and the other three. Every part of this soil is sacred in the estimation of my people. Even the rocks thrill with the memory of stirring events connected with the lives of my people. And the very dust upon which we stand responds lovingly to my footsteps. These are important quotes intellectually about how soil is important for human survival. But what's different in this quote? It's essentially seeing the soil as a relative. Until we can call natural resources our relative and really mean it, we are doomed, would be a hypothesis I would share with you, right? We can do the same thing with looking at the origin stories that all cultures have under the different worldviews. So if we look, for example, at some of the worldviews of the Kalahari Bushmen, you see how people all in all life live together. And you see that the human being is right in a circle with all of the other plants, animals, earth, soil, etc. They all are talking about coming out of the earth. The earth is our home. They're smiling, shaking the sand off their tiny bodies. The ancestors of humans lived in a world under the earth until Spider Woman, an insect, came and got all the colors of clay and to make the 4 races out of the different colored clays. My people, before the bison were created, we also lived underground, emerging from a cave, etc. Horn Chips, the famous medicine leader, gave Crazy Horse a medicine bag of pulverized pocket gopher dirt, and that is what we believe, saved him from getting shot. Right? So it's a different way to look at other than humans, and a way to look at soil. Now, let's consider another origin story. This is Genesis. Genesis says, and Adam said, he said to Adam, "Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth until we turn to the ground." Joseph Campbell, in his work, refers to this kind of worldview precept as a refusal to affirm life. It's not a coincidence that 80% of the biodiversity on our planet today is on only 20% of the soil, and that 20% of the soil is occupied by 5% of the population, which are the traditional indigenous peoples who have not yet forgotten or lost or been unable to do the kinds of things they did to protect the soil. And all of them are, of course, struggling. So, Winona LaDuke the other day on Democracy Now! Was talking about how horrible the conditions are on her reservation. Just like my reservation on Pine Ridge, lifespan of 47 years, etc. But as she was talking about that, she said, still how we treat the land, we treat it as a brother, a mother. Like we did at Standing Rock for 2 hours a morning, the women would lead us into songs about our sister, the river. So here she talks about how they can still drink water from the lakes in Minnesota, that the insects are still there, right? So let's look now, going kind of back full circle to the idea of grazing. If an indigenous worldview, you had talked much about the conflict that you were in the middle of, the cattlemen and the environmentalists, and how difficult that was, right? With indigenous worldview, we can address that. We can address that because one of the tenets of indigenous worldview is about place-based. I'm talking about it in a pan-Indian way of the common worldview denominators, but the most important part of worldview is local knowledge. Okay, and so in that wonderful film, I watched it before, and I thought it was fantastic. They're talking about using animals. Now, you all know that now everyone's talking about it's the animals that are causing so much pollution. The estimates are up to 50% if you include all of the mechanisms and of getting food and everything for it. So, wow, that's kind of a shocking idea. But I saw it work firsthand. I was living with the Taurohomara Rauramuri in a place in Mexico. It took 3 days to hike into, ungodly hike too. And what they do here, you see, these are corrals. And these corrals are moved every 2 days onto a different spot of soil. Now, I don't know if you can tell right here, but this is a puppy dog right here getting its milk from a goat. By the puppies drinking the goat's milk, the puppies then can guard the goats from the onça, the mountain lions, the coyotes, and other things that would come and eat the goats, because they could all jump over this fence really easy, right? So they got this figured out, and the soil is amazing. And when they plant, they don't dig down into the soil. They have a sacred way of talking to the seeds, and which ones are the male seeds, which ones are the female seeds. and they're planted very carefully. I made a mistake one time and they corrected me, but they just laughed about it. Okay, so I really suggest that we can look at this potential solution as something that might help if we look at it from this place space. So I was thinking, well, on where I come from on Pine Ridge, we have a problem with the buffalo being trapped by fences. And in fact, Bill Clinton was the first sitting president of the United States, believe it or not, who ever came to an Indian reservation. And when he came, he began to talk about all the things he was going to do for us. And one of the things, and everybody went, hoo-yah, hoo-yah, as he would say, well, we're going to make sure the roads are going to be this, and you're not going to have commodities that are poisoned with sugar. Everybody went, hoo-yah. And he had promised to go out and look at our buffalo corrals. Well, the buffalo never had corrals before on the Pine Ridge. They were able to graze because we always thought they were smarter than cows, and they knew what grasses to eat at what time. But then the white cattlemen bought up land on the reservation and they built corrals. Oh, by the way, when Clinton stepped off the stage, he was about to step into a cow pie. And one of the boys said, Mr. President, be careful, you're about to step in the hoo-yah. You have to think about that, you Indian. All right, so I did do some research on it in an academic sense. And there is an intensive study in 2017 that did find well-managed grazing in some contexts can cause carbon to be sequestered in the soil. But at an aggregate level, the emissions generated by these grazing systems still outweigh the removals. And even assuming improvements in production, it cannot supply us with all the animal protein that we currently eat. The inescapable conclusion of this report is that while grazing livestock have their place in a sustainable food system, that place is very limited. So we've got to be careful not to use a dominant culture thing, because now people start making money on it, and then pretty soon they forget the balance, they forget local, they don't have indigenous worldview, and pretty soon that which becomes a solution, like carbon credits, becomes a problem because the wrong priorities, worldview priorities, are on it, okay? And there are other studies that say the similar thing, that it's a genuine scientifically uncertainty around it. Well, it's like they're not looking at the difference. I had mentioned to you that the buffaloes were sacred to us and we hated cows. It's just the opposite in other places in Africa, where, and by the way, there's a lot of research that shows that in the plains of America, the efficiency of buffalo grazing is way more significant because of the genetics, the intelligence, etc., than even when cattle are grazed. And so that would be something probably no one has thought about, right? Because we're into the cattle. But in Africa, the cattle work great, but they have a lot more room. And so, you know, we can be also thinking about how do we get more wild animals, because of all the mammals on Earth right now, 96% are livestock and humans. So we're going to kill all the wild animals that used to give us the kind of dung and you know, eat enough grass and all this stuff to make it work. This is in Brazil, where Jair Bolsonaro, the new president, wrote in 2001, I wish we had a more effective cavalry like the Americans did so we could get rid of all the Indians. He's going to be destroying the Amazon rainforest in the next 5 years. So there's a book I came across called Sacred Soil, which is the only reason I named this presentation Sacred Soil. And it contextualizes baked organic matter, showing that in the Amazons for thousands and thousands of years, because the Amazon topsoil is very thin, they actually created systems based on wild animals, based on dying and decaying plants, based on their making fires and covering everything with giant leaves, like banana plant leaves, and leaving it there. They actually nurtured the soil just like the Mitumas people here did up and down the coast here with their silviculture. for thousands of years.
So we're just about wrapping up
All
this
right.
presentation.
So that's
Four
it.
Arrows is always so enthusiastic. I'm sure we're going to have plenty of questions
All right.
and engagement here. How lovely. Can we give him a round of applause? So what we really want to do is to engage you. I mean, maybe there are farmers in the room. We want to have you engage the panel in a conversation about some of the topics that have come up. We have a microphone up here in the front. So if you're able and you have a question, please go ahead and you can walk up to the microphone. If you have a question and are not able to get to the microphone, you can raise your hand and we'll bring it over to you. But there have been a number of topics brought up, and also the panelists can be thinking. I'm sure someone's waiting to get up. They're just on their way to the mic right now. But also the panelists can be thinking about questions for each other, some of the things that you thought about. And also when you come up, just let us know your name and how you're connected to fielding. And
Okay, so my name is Dr. Robin Lynn Treptow, and I'm one of the Fielder Fellows. And this is not my area of study at Fielding, but I'm very passionate about of plant-based diet. And I heard one of the speakers I thought they were going to go in that direction. But I didn't really hear that talked about in this discussion. And I'm very curious about that because I've heard numerous presentations and read numerous articles that go down that particular track. And so I guess I'd invite anyone from the panel to go that direction.
Well, just real briefly, they weren't hunter-gatherers, they were gatherer-hunters. Meat was very infrequent in many of the cultures. And so that's one piece from my perspective.
Yeah, my sense is that in terms of producing human food from some environments, meat is actually the only valid thing you can grow. You can't grow vegetables in the boreal forest. You can't eat moose. You can't support very many people doing that, mind you. That if you actually want to support human populations in the temperate zone, meat's a wildly inefficient way of doing that on the whole. And also, the way we tend to produce animals in high density tends to be pretty rough on soils.
The only thing I would add to that is, while yes, I'm certainly a fan of the value of plant-based diets, I think we need to be very careful about. I mean, I've heard a number of people, for example, say, the solution to our socio-ecological crises is for everyone to go vegan. And without connecting to questions around worldview, around militarism, around social equality, et cetera, that becomes quite limited. I mean, for example, I do eat tofu that I know, comes from places perhaps, in the Amazon where indigenous peoples lived, where land has been raised, where climate change is being exacerbated, et cetera. So without connecting to those questions and without understanding the deep ecological and social impacts of industrial agriculture, whether we're talking about today or going back 10, 12, 15,000 years where pastoralism began, which many, many folks have begun to take a look at as perhaps the original sin. Settled agriculture, civilization itself is a far deeper problem than, say, capitalism, state-based power, et cetera. So plant-based diets, I think, outside of that context, is a limited framework. But I am a vegetarian.
And I am too, and I just want to add, I think local food is probably really the healthiest because I have so many vegan friends who are ordering coconuts from Thailand and chowing down on all these foods that are from so far away. So I think, and like the soy issue too, right? The rainforest being raised to grow soy or cattle. So yeah, so you just want to be careful, I think, eat local if you can.
So, David Blake Willis, I'm a fifth generation Iowan, so I appreciated the Iowa soil things here. We have some severe crises happening right now, and I have it around fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, and insects. And maybe some comments around those topics would be great.
Well, Bill Moyer's film from many years ago, Earth on Edge, he showed how one farmer in Kansas, a wheat farmer, was doing everything right. And he asked the farmer, how come all your neighbors aren't doing this? Why are they using fertilizer and pesticide? And the three things that came out of the research was, my dad did it that way. My banks won't loan me money if I don't use fertilizer. And big time marketers and advertising, taking them out on the road.
I'll add a slightly different spin on that. We take a lot off fields, and if you don't replace the nitrogen and the phosphorus that gets removed and shipped off as in the food, you will deplete the environment, and those resources have to come from somewhere. Fertilizers are one way of doing that, of ensuring that you are replacing the things you remove and used in modest amounts and appropriately, no problem. One problem with nitrogen is we often historically have dumped on all that we think we might need over the course of the entire year with one pass of the tractor, often after you've removed the last crop. And then much of that nitrogen either ends up as nitrate in our waterways, contaminating them, or in the atmosphere as nitrous oxide, causing greenhouse gases. So, replacing the inputs is important, and that's what a fertilizer is. So used within that kind of intellectual concept, it's perfectly sustainable and perfectly useful. But as with eating meat, we don't have much opportunity to do that. If we want to maintain our production systems at the kind of peak levels of production that we want to, that has also required more inputs than you can get out of natural, just ecological processes. No fertilizers typically would mean lower yields, lower production. Now, if you can deal with that, that's okay. But if you're in an industrialized market economy, that is sort of problematic. So there are these balances here. Used well, okay. We've always used fertilizers of some sort. It's the over-fertilization and dumping more on than a system can deal with that means you end up with stuff running off and sort of skewing the production models.
Yeah, because what they were baking essentially was fertilizer, right? But it was natural fertilizer, and they didn't have a profit motive per se.
I'm Richard Applebaum, I guess a zero-generation Santa Barbaran. So we shop their farmers markets every day of the week here, practically. Tri-county produce, mainly sources locally. We shop in these places and we feel great about it, but sometimes it feels like so small in relationship to the size of the problem. I mean, with the world population going from 7 billion to 9 or 10 billion, with major parts of the world industrializing, and with climate change, I wonder if each of the panelists could, what is the one thing, give us hope. What is the one thing you would recommend?
Chocolate.
So I happen to be on the board of directors for the Union of Concerned Scientists, and just this morning there was some consultants that were calling different people on the board and through the staff at UCS to evaluate the Food and Environment program. And I'm a graduate of the agroecology program at UC Santa Cruz, and so it's been a long time ago, but I have this connection. And one of the things that I brought up today that is a focus of UCS, but I think is part of a larger discussion, is the relationship between health in this country and diet coming from agriculture. And we need to connect those dots and help people understand whether it's a social, an environmental justice issue or what have you. But that relationship and recognizing how subsidies and a variety of other components of that industrial model are influencing what we eat or how we eat and where we eat. And I think, I've lived in places like Santa Cruz and visited places like here. And California is, a breadbasket, and it's a breadbasket of fruits and vegetables and specialty crops. Other parts of the country just don't have the climate to do what we're doing here. So we are very lucky here in California on a lot of fronts as far as what we can eat that's local and what have you. But as we heard from well, we're not going to call them food deserts, but whatever they are. There are a lot of those, especially, in urban areas. And I think we really have to look at the opportunity to change, especially the USDA and some of the larger agencies that are involved in, in guiding that the relationship and the interactions between these different components in shaping what food is available and at what price. Because I'm sorry, there's no excuse for dollar hamburgers retail in this country while vegetables are 2 and 3 times more expensive. I mean, it's just not, from an energetics, from an ecology, from any other metric, it doesn't make sense. Meat should be staggeringly expensive because it's expensive to produce. And vegetables, depending on what they are, should be a much cheaper option. And if we had those choices and we were paying the real ecological or environmental price of the things we enjoy, we would be eating far more healthily than we do today.
Kim, he wanted to know if you were hopeful.
Yeah, I am hopeful. I think we can do it. I see people. One of the other things I've said in this, in this question session this morning is that we're seeing organizations that understand this are going into the communities. We can't have this high level. It's got to be a ground up, bottom up approach to address these challenges. And it's going to be neighborhood by neighborhood, community by community, state by state. And when you have large enough examples to point to, whether it's in this country or elsewhere, I think we can see the kind of change that we need if we want to sustain both the quality of life and the numbers of people that we are going to see in the future.
Hopeful, or what's your story?
One hopeful thing I would say is do your best to grow as much of your own food as possible. Now, for many people, that sounds like a challenge, but I know people all across the world who are growing food, even when they live in small, cramped apartments, herbs. Many of my students grow potatoes in garbage cans, mushrooms in their own dormitories, inside closets. They're literally growing pounds of food that they are giving out to each other. I have a student at SBCC who's working on permaculture, who's engaging with the students and the staff and the faculty there to take the existing fruit on campus and harvest that sustainably, a sustainable yield, to provide that for food. Free food through the food bank. One final thing, I had a visitor, a young woman from Orlando, Florida, who came to a class of mine last year. She is the executive director of a group called Urban Fleet Farm, I think it is. And they go block by block through that city and ask homeowners, can we convert your entire front yard to a garden? And the answer is almost always yes, because they tell the homeowners, we will give you 10% of the yield. And they think, well, but 10%, that doesn't sound like much. Most of these homeowners do not know what to do with the amount of food that is grown in their own front yards. It is such a bounty. It is an incredible amount of food. And then then this Urban Fleet Farm group then sells, gives it away, et cetera, to folks who really need it, making people who are less food secure more food secure. So I am hopeful because I see people making something out of seemingly nothing every day.
Those kinds of things do make me hopeful, but I also have this kind of gut feeling that planet Earth passed its carrying capacity for Homo sapiens in about 1950. And that we have been depleting our resources because there's just too many people using too much and eating too much. And I think that is a fundamental problem that we recognize in the 1960s with the population bomb. We sort of let go of because it becomes too socially, politically, ethically uncomfortable to talk about population. But I still have this kind of gut feeling, and that number is based on nothing other than, that's sort of when we started seeing some of these global scope of environmental problems, that there's just still a lot too many people on it. If we don't deal with that issue, we're gonna have a hard time dealing with things with wonderful small scale stuff. But there's still just a lot of people we're trying to feed, and that's a hard thing to do. So I sort of, I'd like to be hopeful, but it's hard. I was a professor in the environmental studies program. I tend to focus on all the great things we can do.
You remember we started with the opening of listening to a lullaby that a Cherokee mother sang to her baby on the Trail of Tears. I'm not hopeful. I believe if you had asked me 10 years ago, I would have said yes. I think we've reached a place, and with the systems ahead of us, we're not going to turn it around. But that story was about what we might refer to as courageous hopelessness.
I like that term.
And if you have that, and that requires a worldview that understands a larger time frame, a larger cycle, and is concerned with the very future generations. And so it's really kind of an optimism, because you don't stop the work if you have courageous hopelessness.
I wasn't sure, did you have a question as well, or were you waiting?
I'm not sure if there's time. It seems like such a nice closure.
So I'd like for us to at least hear your two questions. I mean, part of the reason why I was so aggressive with cutting people off is because we want the engagement. So if you could share your two questions, and we'll respond to what we can.
So my name is Gisela Wentling, and I'm a 2005 graduate from Fielding. And I had the great opportunity to facilitate the California Roundtable on Water and Food Supply for a few years. So I brought my OD skills, my systems thinking skills, to something I knew nothing about, which was water in California and food production. And this roundtable developed a connectivity approach and some principles that they identified that could help actually address these problems in a more systemic way. And they identified, thinking in a connected way, linking institution, and then public education. But the one area around linking institutions to develop whole systems goals is something that is so missing across the whole infrastructure that manages the resources. So there are so many institutions that are only advancing their particular agenda. And I'm curious about, is there anybody who is tracking on that level on how are we changing policy? How are we changing the dissemination of resources? And actually what they came up with was the beginning of a meme that identified connected benefits. How can we plan so that every stakeholders is actually receiving a benefit from how we are solving these problems? So that thinking has been reapplied for them several times. So it makes me hopeful, but it raises for me questions. How are we paying attention to what is happening? What are the best practices across the systems that we need to amplify? That's my question.
And I would just want to hear the other question, and then you all can have an opportunity to respond to both. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Holly Wright. I work with Channel Islands Restoration. I also do a lot of outreach with schools. I work with schools in Ventura County and Los Angeles County, and it was more of a message of hope as well. I've been involved with many school gardens where kids have done the garden to cafeteria program, and they grow food successfully and happily. And in the process, they also, some of them may learn about soils if they're interested in soil. Like we've had kids use moisture meters and get excited about science. Kids who enjoyed the compost. There's teamwork, and one thing I found interesting about the process as well. The process is that it's important to. We want to know that the water is clean, that the kids are being able to use, and also the soil. If you're in an urban environment, although the concept of growing food to in the garden to the table is great, making sure that the soil is healthy. So in some ways, it's a way to actually practically work on the soil that's right in that urban environment, and also funding, because these programs are going on. The kids love it, the teachers love it, the parents love it, but it's constantly being able to keep the funding coming to the schools.
Well, just real quickly, in terms of the two questions, the last slide here was the panel last year, the chair of the Chumash people. I asked, and he created something that nobody else in all of Ventura County could do. Their community saved more water, used less water than all of the other communities together. And I got up on the microphone and I said, Mr. Chairman, I have a strange question for you. Were your spiritual traditions, did they have anything to do with it? And I had no idea if he was going to ask it. And this is what he says on the bottom. This is a direct quote from this panel last year. Absolutely. That's the driver. We're talking in his indigenous worldview. Absolutely, that's the driver. And you can read the rest.
And so Sorry, just to follow up that last, sorry. There's a Chumash tribal leader, I'm not sure if it's the same man, who's advisor for Rio School District's new STEAM school.
Same guy.
Right, and that whole school is built upon this. And those kids work a lot within the learning about the Santa Clara River, and there's a lot of agriculture in Ventura River. And a lot of the time when we do outreach with the kids, we talk about, how much food is gone to waste in our fridge or all this sort of thing. So I think there's huge hope. It's just consistent work. And also, like the lady was saying, communication between scientists.
Do you want to briefly answer? The food is being brought in, which is an important sign that we're moving to the next phase. There'll be an opportunity to continue this discussion over food, and the panelists can maybe circulate and cycle.
Are we cutting
And
off?
I just have some closing comments. So did you want to answer?
Well, I wanted to, I've been thinking about the system level question that the lady was asking. And one of the beauty of living on islands is that they're microcosms. They have all of the elements of continents and large land masses, but the relationships and the connectivity are much simpler because the lines between cause and effect or source and outcome are much shorter. And from a modeling or from a systems analysis approach, you can look at some of these connections in a way that is a lot clearer to understand or recognize. And again, the time and complexity is much shorter between, like I said, cause and effect. And so I like to look at islands as sort of testing grounds for looking at the relationships at that large holistic scale. And, it's what I'm trying to do with this hazard mitigation plan is take a more holistic approach to thinking about the problems and the outcomes. And I do think we should be using, small communities or islands like in that way to think about, because the human behavior is the same and what have you. But the fact is, when you screw up, you notice it right away on islands. And so I think we have tools and opportunities to address some of these complex questions and then hopefully try and translate them to larger, more complex systems. But those relationships that may be obscure or not even obvious in continental settings become far more obvious or clear in these smaller, simpler systems. So I think that is an option for us.
So I just had, there were a bunch of thoughts going through my head as the panel, but I'm glad we had questions that filled up the time. But some thoughts I wanted to say is that really I hope that this is the beginning of conversations that continue. So there is this, and maybe Rich, you're about to talk about the Sustainability Working Group, but there's the Inclusive Leadership for Social Justice. Some of you know that I have Melker's Open Classroom. I'm actually going to have a conversation with Leah Penniman in case you were missing the farmer on the panel. But I'm gonna have a virtual conversation with her that anyone in the fielding community is welcome to join Wednesday, February 20th. You can go on Melker's Open Classroom to find out more information about that. And I was, when I hear the question about solutions, I hope that people will take up multiple of the solutions, that you will, not just pick one, but pick many solutions. And I also wanted to say about the food deserts. Leah Penniman is also someone who says she doesn't like that word, and it's because deserts are naturally occurring. And so we talk about food apartheid in that community because it's really important and connected to that when we talk about whether or not people need slaves. Like something jumped at me when you said that, and part of that is because it's important whether or not we think of slaves as a type of person or we think of enslavement as a status, right? So if we understand that, because if we understand it is a status and we're talking about people, then what we're saying is people needing people, which, right? So, but so just attention to what's so important when we're thinking about social and ecological justice is to keep track of both the human and the non-human at the same time, right? Because if we lose track of either one, catastrophes can happen. So thank you so much. We've got a quick announcement from Orlando Telly, and then I'm really going to give it to Rich.
Take a moment. This event tonight was co-sponsored by the Marie Fielder Center. And one of the things that we do is to try to connect with other universities. I want to just acknowledge Kim Waddell.
Right.
Schools are here. We are partnering with the University of the Virgin Islands with our large NSF grant, as you probably all know. And the fact that Kim's now really a part of us in a certain way because Fielding and UVI are connected, I just want to acknowledge that to say that he's not just a guest tonight. Welcome, Kim.
Thank you.
So I just want to conclude first by giving a big call out and thanks to Melcor, who does it all. Not only on this topic and managing a highly vocal panel, but taking care of the technological issues. So thanks to her. I want to thank the panel, and I want to thank the hotel staff who do a lot of the work behind the scenes to make this possible. Thank you. And I'm not going to make a speech. I just want to say, all my life, I've been a dirt guy. I will never look at soil again the same way. I mean, this has been an eye-opener to me. Really, it brought me down deep in a way. So I really appreciate the panel. You began with your wonderful film, a quote from Rumi, which I wrote down, and I just want to repeat it. Let the beauty we love be what we do. There are hundreds of ways to kneel and kiss the ground. I think we need, well, at my age, it's kind of hard to kneel and kiss the ground sometimes, but I think we need to remember, as Arrows pointed out, what was simply assumed as knowledge from people who lived close to the ground for many years. And at the risk of revealing my hippie origins, get back to the land and set our soul free. Thanks to Joni Mitchell.
Hey, Rich.